We continue on today with our series on faith that matters as we go through the listing in Hebrews 11, which is an unusual chapter. It defines faith, and then it has a listing of examples of faith throughout the Old Testament. And we ask the question is, what is this faith? We know we're saved by faith. We're saved by grace through faith, to be precise. But what is this faith? Is it just intellectual belief? Is it just agreeing with a creed? And the working definition we are working on here is that faith is not just a belief to be believed, but a life to be lived and a God to be followed. And that has held up throughout our study of all these examples of faith. As we ask the question, then what does faith look like? If it's not just a belief, but it's a life, what does a life of faith look like? And we've seen some different things. To Noah, it was a life of standing out from the crowd. For Abraham, it was a life of leaving, moving, giving up something most precious. For Sarah, we learned that faith doesn't always look like faith. Faith doesn't mean perfection. Sometimes we have to process before we react in faith. From the patriarchs, we learned that faith goes the distance. It does not end. It goes all the way to the very end. And from Moses, last week we learned that faith is sometimes walking away from prosperity and riches and standing up against a dangerous foe without fear. All those things are what faith looks like. Today we look at Rahab, which is an interesting one to say the least. But Rahab is there in Hebrews chapter 11. If you look at me in Hebrews 11 at verses 30 and 31, where it says, "By faith the walls of Jericho fell down after they had been encircled for 7 days. By faith Rahab the harlot did not perish along with those who were disobedient after she had welcomed the spies in peace." So we start with Jericho. Just a word on Jericho, because it does mention that. We've been looking at individuals and saying, what does faith look like? Jericho is more than an individual. It's what can faith do when a whole group of people unite in it. And you know the story. I'm not going to spend time with that. You know the story of Jericho, that first city, kingdom, fortress that they conquered when they entered the promised land. And what an amazing battle plan they had to go up and actually walk around the city once every day for 7 days. And on the seventh day, walk around the city 7 times and blow their trumpets. There was their plan. Their plan was from God. And as you know, the walls of the mighty Jericho came down and the slaughter was on. And I think we're not going to spend a lot of time there. We're going to focus on Rahab. But the lesson there is large groups united in faith can bring down walls. And that's a true principle. Large groups united in faith can bring down walls. But we're going to focus on Rahab. What it says in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 31, "By faith, Rahab the harlot did not perish along with those who were disobedient after she had welcomed the spies in peace." So what we're told in Hebrews is she was a harlot. She was a prostitute. An unlikely person to be in the hall of faith in Hebrews chapter 11. We're also told there that those people in Jericho were slaughtered because of their disobedience. You know, there's certain streams of people that like to look at the Old Testament and say, God's not a good God. He's a God of genocide. Look what they did when they came in the promised land. They just wiped out entire people. From God's perspective, it was their disobedience. An interesting little aside, before they entered the promised land, they conquered the Amorites. But earlier they had a chance to conquer the Amorites, and God said to them, "No, not yet, for their iniquity is not full yet of the Amorites." In other words, it would not yet be just to wipe them out. You see, our God's a God of justice. And he sees hearts, and he sees the truth. And what we see in Jericho is it wasn't just as people being wiped out for the people of God to come in. It was righteous. It was their disobedience that was the result. And Rahab stood out among the Jerichoites for not being disobedient, but having faith. And then it tells the story of the spies. So we have to look at that story. Joshua chapter 2 is where we're going from here. Joshua chapter 2. Please turn there if you have your Bibles, or push those buttons on your phone. So they're getting ready to go into the promised land. They've not yet crossed the Jordan yet they send 2 spies to check out the land, just to see what's out there, and especially to check out Jericho. They were gathering military intelligence. They were going for it. By the way, they sent spies out earlier in the promised land, did they not? Like 40 years earlier, they sent 12 of them in to do the very same thing. And as you know, 10 of them came back and said, it's a suicide mission. No, we can't do it. And one was Joshua, who is leading them now, and the other, Caleb, came back and said, our God is God. Why not? Well, this time they sent 2 in, and that was not going to happen again. I think they learned their lesson in the wilderness for that entire generation. But so they send 2 in. They're to check out Jericho, and they do. Now, where do you think spies are going to find a place to stay and hide out when they're in Jericho? Well, they're not going to go to the main street, to the main Hilton hotel where everybody goes. They're going to go to some place that is clandestine, hidden in the cracks, in the back alleys. Like, for instance, a place where a prostitute would be. You know, prostitutes don't usually do their work in the limelight. They're in the back alleys, because men going to prostitutes usually sneak there. That's the way it was then as it is today. So, yeah, this makes sense. They find a prostitute that will welcome them in. But this is a very unique person. So we read in chapter 2, beginning with verse 1 of Joshua. Then Joshua the son of Nun sent 2 men as spies secretly into Shittim, saying, go view the land, especially Jericho. So they went and came to the house of a harlot whose name was Rahab, and they lodged there. That makes sense. However, they were found out. They were discovered. For it says in verse 2, it was told the king of Jericho, saying, behold, men of the sons of Israel had come here tonight to search out the land, and the king of Jericho sent word to Rahab. They found out that they were not only there, they found out through their connections that they went to Rahab's place. That's where they were hanging out. So he goes to Rahab, saying, bring out the men who have come to you, who have entered your house, for they have come to search out all the land. But the woman had taken the 2 men and hidden them. And she said, yes, men came to me, but I did not know where they were from. It came about that when it was time to shut the gate, the men went out. I do not know where the men went. Pursue them quickly, and you will overtake them. But she had brought them up on the roof and hidden them in the stalks of flax, which she had laid in order on the roof. So the men pursued them on the road to the Jordan, to the fords, and soon as those who were pursuing them had gone out, they shut the gate. And now, before they lay down, she came up to them on the roof. So she risked her own life by hiding these guys. Why? Why would she do that? Hid them up on the roof in some stalks of flax, and then told them that, yeah, they left. If you hurry, you might get them. Well, now we see really what was going on here, what this faith was all about. We look at verse 9. She said to the men, I know that the Lord, that's Yahweh, I know that Yahweh has given you the land. Now, how did she know that? How did a prostitute from Jericho know that Yahweh had given them this land? Well, we learn from this, these people were not unknown. The word of these Israelites from the time they left Egypt had spread throughout the world, and people were keeping tabs on them. And there were no doubt reports that, yeah, these people are out in the wilderness, and if you go look at them, there's a pillar of cloud by day and fire by night. And then as they began getting closer and started conquering people like the Amorites, that word spread, and these people were scared to death of the Hebrews. Verse 10, for we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before you, and how you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the 2 kings of the Amorites, who are beyond the Jordan, to Sihon and Og, whom you utterly destroyed. When we heard it, our hearts melted, and no courage remained in any man any longer because of you. For the Lord your God, Yahweh your Elohim, he is God in heaven above and on earth beneath. Now therefore please swear to me by the Lord that since I have dealt kindly with you, that you will also deal kindly with my father's household and give me a pledge of truth. So Rahab says, I know that your God is God, and I know he's giving you this land. She put it all together when she heard all these stories. And she believed. Remember faith? One who comes to God must believe that he is, that he is God and that he is a rewarder of those who seek him. So she says to them, would you please deal kindly with me and my family? And of course they do. And the rest of the story is they are sent down on ropes from a window because her place is on the wall with an open window, and they are lowered down so that they escape, and they tell her to tie a scarlet rope on that window so that when people come, they will know that's the place that they are to save. So that's the story. That's the story of Rahab, the prostitute, and how she believed. She believed Yahweh was God and that he was indeed giving this land to his people, and she sought his favor. It's interesting when you go to James. James lists Rahab as one of those people that, as an example of how faith without works is dead. He says, here's an example, Rahab. Was it just her faith that saved her, or the fact that her faith led her to hide those spies? And indeed, it was. So now, do you want the rest of the story? Because it gets much more interesting than this. If you go to Joshua chapter 6, just a few pages over, Joshua chapter 6, and we are looking specifically at verses 21 through 25 of Joshua 6. So they utterly destroyed everything in the city. Of course, we already mentioned they walked around 7 times on the 7th day and blew their horns, and the walls fell down. And they utterly destroyed everything in the city, both men and women, young and old, oxen, sheep, and donkey, with the edge of the sword. And Joshua said to the 2 men who had spied out the land, go to the harlot's house and bring the woman and all she has out there, as you have sworn to her. So the young men who were the spies went in and brought out Rahab and her father and her mother and her brothers and all she had, and they brought out all her relatives and placed them outside the camp of Israel. Now this is, any good Hebrew would do this. You've rescued these people, you've wiped out everybody else in the city, you are now setting up camp outside the city, and these people are not Hebrews, they are Gentiles, they are unclean. They're set up outside the camp. That would be the natural thing to do. Here's what's interesting as we read on. They burned the city with fire, verse 24, and all that was in it, only the silver and gold and articles and bronze and iron, they put into the treasury of the house of the Lord. However, Rahab the harlot and her father's household and all that she had, Joshua spared, and she lived in the midst of Israel to this day. Now, how did they get from outside the camp, which had been the natural thing, to in the midst? We don't know that story. We don't know the discussions that took place, but God moved in the hearts of people, and they were welcomed into the very midst of Israel for the rest of their lives. And they were not Jews, they were Gentiles, they were Jerichoites. But that's not even the end of the story, because if you look at Matthew 1 and the genealogy of Jesus Christ, you find that Rahab married a Hebrew by the name of Salmon. And Rahab and Salmon had a son whose name was Boaz. Does that ring a bell? This is the Boaz of the story of Ruth. Now, Boaz was only half Hebrew because he was half Jerichoite, or whatever you call them. And if we know the story of Boaz, Boaz is the one who married Ruth, who was a Moabitess. So this one half Hebrew married a 0 Hebrew, Moabitess, and they had a son and named him Moab, or Obed. Obed, by the way, is 1/4 Hebrew. Just keep that in mind. We would assume he married a Hebrew woman and had a son named Jesse, which would make Jesse about 60% Hebrew. Jesse is the father of David. Jesse is the father of David. So David was only about 80% Hebrew, King David, and about 20% Gentile. He had a son by Bathsheba. Now, we don't know Bathsheba's nationality, but she was married to a Hittite, and Hebrew women generally did not marry Hittites. And David was not attracted to her by her glorious and wonderful Hebrew heritage. He was attracted to her by the way she looked bathing. Let's be honest. So Solomon was King Solomon, was probably only about 40% Hebrew, and the rest Gentiles. See, it was about all nationalities all the way down the line, and we go right on down to Jesus Christ, who in his flesh had a not insignificant amount of Gentile blood going through his veins. Probably never considered that before. But this is Rahab in the line of Jesus Christ, a woman of faith, a least likely candidate to be a woman of faith. For one thing, a woman in that day and age was a second-class citizen. You know, we have a lot of issues today with equality and all that, and we have grown to the point where there is very few places where a woman will make less at the same job than a man. But as you ladies probably know, in many areas of employment, there are not the opportunities for women there are for men. There's still some inequity there. But back then, you were second-class citizens. Not to mention a prostitute. You know, no one ever wants their daughters to grow up to be prostitutes. No one really ever chooses that as a preferred profession. It's usually out of necessity to live that you get to that point of degradation. A Gentile, woman, prostitute, by faith, became an ancestor of none other than Jesus Christ. What we see here is the most faithful may often seem the least likely. The most faithful may seem the least likely. Do not judge books by their covers when it comes to the area of faith. Paul talks about this, James talks about this, the sin of partiality, of judging people by the way they look. God chooses the least likely to do the most good. After all, didn't he choose you and I? Case in point. So we see Rahab and we see the grace of God. We had a men's Bible study many years on early Wednesday mornings. And for a while there was a man that came to us who was heavily influenced by Herbert W. Armstrong's Worldwide Church of God. Back then he was totally into the idea that the lost tribes of Israel migrated north, and basically England was Ephraim and USA was Manasseh, and we were really Israelites, and we were supposed to keep the laws and all that. The Worldwide Church of God has repented of those things, by the way, since Armstrong passed away, and they are much more in the more standard evangelical fold. But this guy was influenced at it, and we were studying Galatians, and we had some interesting discussions with him. Because we shouldn't be eating pork, and we need to worship on the right day. And he went through a whole spiel on me on that, and he ended up by saying, you see, it's not about grace, it's about race. Well, if you ever hear that, please walk away from that discussion. What we learned from Rahab and looking at its genealogy, it has nothing to do with race. It is about grace. It's about the grace of God. And we celebrate the table this morning, that cross, and that's open for everybody. There is no one in whatever strata of society they may be in, whatever their past history might be, whatever their life situation is, there's no one who is not welcome to the cross, welcome to the table, because it is all about the grace of God. And yes, Rahab was a significant woman in the kingdom of God, and right on down through to the line of Jesus Christ. It'd be interesting to me, and we don't know how they went from outside the camp to in the camp, but God was certainly at work there. And our God was always about all nations. Yes, there was a people that he chose, that he revealed himself through powerfully, and through whom came the Messiah. But from that point on, it's all about every tribe and tongue and nation of people and strata of society and occupation and all those things. The grace of God, there is no one who is disqualified by who they are. And here we see what faith looks like. Sometimes faith comes in packages that you would not expect any faith to come in. But that's just how our God works. Let's pray.